Welcome back to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University. And welcome back to our 7th session of this little series where I just talk at you for a little bit. But what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit more about the open source analogy model. I kind of gave this sort of rambling idea of what this is, but essentially it's a flexible implementation model. But so what? Why is that important? There's other flexible models of implementation out there. Just because we're talking about research fidelity or research integrity does not necessarily mean that we're doing things in lockstep. Flexibility is always built in. It has to be. But what does this model mean for research and how to make it relevant? This is an important part of it. And the way I see it, it's really a lot of it is talking back to the other one where we talked about how do we know when research is ready to implement? Well, you can make it so by yourself. In other words, it doesn't have to be a big communal effort or a consortium. One scholar can do this, and one scholar can do this and also meet some of the ideas that you have in terms of the incentives for being productive when it comes to research. So here's what I mean by this. By the way, it also is very helpful for theory building and theory testing. Here's how it works. It's a fairly simple conceptually. It's hard to do in real life, but it's conceptually fairly simple. So in the open source analogy model, remember we have a traditional validation, an experiment that demonstrates that our intervention, therapy, reading, behavior, whatever it is, it demonstrates some effectiveness. In other words, it shows that when you have a well-controlled control group, the intervention group is significantly higher. That's great. That's the starting point. That's step one. I refer to that as always proof of concept. That means the intervention can work sometimes in some situations for some students. And that's fantastic. But we treat that now like that's the end point, or that's the highest level you can get to be evidence-based practice. In fact, that's just the introduction. And that's fine. That's wonderful. First thing you do when you have an intervention that's successful, you have this proof of concept. It's really important to have it be theory. But what I really mean by that is you have to break it down at the very least into elements that other people can use to implement. What are the process instructions, or what is the methodology that you're going to use in terms of how you present the information, how you present the intervention? So the process, how do you do it? Second element is materials. Are there any materials you need? Whether it's pencils or computers or software, whatever it is. The third part is what activity is it going to be in a classroom or in a intervention? In other words, does it replace something? Is it in lieu of traditional mathematics instruction, we're using this? Where does it fit into someone's normal ideas? Because remember, it's not just that it's a good idea, it has to fit into a schedule or replace something else. If it's replacing something else, you have to identify what it is. We're using this literacy model. This intervention works very well. We're going to replace another literacy model with it. This is often a very complex component of developing an element, but if you're going to implement it in the real world, it's essential that you know what it's replacing or what it's moving aside or what it's supplementing. Time. How much does it take? What is the dosage of the intervention that's required for effectiveness? We often don't have that when we say something's effective. We don't know what dosage is effective. Is a reading intervention effective with the same degree of outcomes if we do it 5 days a week, 3 hours a day, or if we do it 15 minutes a day for 3 months? Are those the same things? So knowing the dosage and how much time it will demand is also important. And the fifth element, process instructions, materials, what activities, how much time or dosage. And then the fifth one is what type of expertise and training does it require? Many interventions work well because you have a well-trained staff, often of graduate students or other people who are well-trained. What would it take for a teacher or parent or therapist? What would it take for them to be effectively trained to put forth all the elements of the intervention well? So you have to have that component of it. Then finally, once you have that, then you begin applying your intervention in multiple situations. Could be multiple classrooms, could be multiple therapy groups or other types of centers. So you've got it, it works. You've broken it down into exactly how you can implement it. Now you begin to apply it. Teachers, parents, other people who may need this intervention, they begin to apply it across multiple groups. You give most of, if not all of the people implementing this, complete permission to change this to meet the unique needs of the client or the system or the students or the therapist. They can make changes and then tell them what they cannot change. There's some certain components, certain processes that cannot change, as we talked about previously. So as long as they know that, they can make changes. We'd like them to document those changes so we know exactly what they are, but make the changes. Make it work for you. Own it, and then it'll really work. And then what you have is, let's say you develop an intervention, prove it's effective, then you implement it with all of these interventions that are slightly different. What you're doing is not only creating an implementation strategy, but you're creating a whole bunch of conceptual replications. You're not replicating the exact same thing, you're replicating just variations on it. But the kernel is going to stay the same. So imagine if we had interlocking circles like a Venn diagram. They would all be mostly the same, but a little bit different on the margins. And what this will help us tell is how robust is an intervention. This is an important factor that we rarely ever talk about. There are some interventions that you can get away with just implementing them with 30, 40% accuracy, and they're wonderfully great. Social skills training is quite a bit like this. That social skills training tends to be fairly robust. But there's other interventions that are not robust at all. It's just the nature of the intervention. A good example might be therapy for specific phobias. There's quite a clear and distinct behavioral protocol that must take place, and you really can't deviate from it very much at all. That's not a very robust intervention. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's wonderful, but you can't mess around with it. You have to keep it exactly as stated. It would be very helpful for us to create relevant research if we knew how robust an intervention is. The idea of doing multiple conceptual replications with implementers free to make a lot of different changes really gives us a good sense of how much change can take place before it is not effective anymore. In other words, at what point do we have a fatal mutation? I think it's less likely to have a fatal mutation if we put in there exactly what cannot be changed. Nonetheless, conceptual replication is a big part of this. But you consistently use the exact same outcome measures. In other words, you can change the intervention and the process. You can't change the outcome measures. They need to be exactly the same. If you're using standardized assessment, curriculum-based measurement, behavior observations, you need to have those exact same outcome measures that you used in the proof of concept study. You also need to have it's helpful for research to indicate what is the degree of treatment integrity. There's methods out there. There's some really good methods, whether they're self-report or observation. There's a lot of good methods for that. But you want to find out using the exact same outcomes to compare these groups. In other words, some things can change a little bit. The nature of the intervention, some teams have to stay the same. So that's a really big deal. And typically from the intervention point of view, you give feedback on the effectiveness, report that back to the implementer, to the teacher, the therapist, whomever. And then sometimes you look at what are the changes that people have made that are the most effective. And that can help change your intervention. It's kind of a crowdsource. And that crowdsource type of improvement keeps things dynamic. So this is really the essence of it. Now, why is that good for research? Why it's good for research is because when you do these conceptual interventions, and sometimes we had some interventions going in as many as, I think it was about 90 different classrooms, which is fantastic. So really you got 90 different circles that are all slightly different. The kernel stays the same. There's always overlap with that kernel. It's almost like you see those old conceptual ideas of factor analysis in intelligence where the G factor is always stable. It'd be like that with your intervention too, is what it would look like. But you can see what interventions variations worked, what didn't. What works so well that you might want to integrate that into the kernel and integrate it back into the theory that you're talking about. So if we find, for example, that we see that when we change the languages of the intervention, because we might be implementing it in English and in French and in Spanish and in Cree or whatever language we're working with, if we see that that change of language was a key factor, that could change our ideas about emotional regulation so that we can implement and integrate language into the theory. So it's a theory testing idea, as well as a theory development idea. What if you have an intervention that's atheoretical? There's no long tradition of theories of components, and I'm having a hard time thinking of one. But even social skills doesn't have the best theories of social skills. And so what you do with it is you can create these intervening circles, and then you try to see what they all have in common, and then you can develop a theory out of that. So conceptual replications are a fantastic way to go, and it's a great way to implement. But it really can lead to theory testing and theory development by looking at how robust the ideas are, how much change can take place before it stops working, and then what makes it work. So I think the concept of robustness should really be a construct that we could work on, and it could be something like, I don't know, the average of all the conceptual replications effect size divided by the effect size for the proof of concept all over the percentage of treatment fidelity. That could be a measure of robustness. I'll have to look into that. I think that might work. But that's a crude idea. But robustness, how much can we change it and have it still be effective, is a major factor that we really need to know. But even if let's say you're a professor, you had these academic incentives with these pressure to publish. Well, there's a lot of papers if you follow this model. The proof of concept is what we typically think of as one publication. I developed this new social emotional learning intervention. I followed its effectiveness. It worked great for 200 kids compared to a control group. Great, publish it. Well, but you can also publish the multiple replications, extensions, improvements every time you do this and apply it to new classrooms. So 2 to 10 may be publishable papers out of that. Also, you can look at the process. What was the process of systematic implementation did you use to actually get them into these schools? Did you use what factors were you controlled in that? So how you did it can many times be a standalone manuscript that focuses on the process of implementation. We see a lot in journals like Implementation Science, looking at the science and the structure of how you implement something. That's one of the exciting areas in our field, and why research relevance is so important, is that implementation science is now literally a science. We called it implementation science for a while, and honestly, it wasn't too scientific, but it's really good now. And I really like seeing some of the science and ideas out of there, and there's publications in that. There's also some publications in this model for theory testing and theory development. Once you have a proof of concept, multiple different incarnations of that based on where you are and the changes made, there's opportunities for you to talk about how a theory has changed, evolved, been tested, been challenged, or developed based on these multiple models. And then finally, you could have a meta-analysis. If you do a whole bunch of conceptual replications over a variety of areas, then you can look at median effect size and various metrics for the effectiveness there. And it's easier because you're not comparing apples to oranges. It's always apples to apples because it's always your intervention. So I'm not saying that's an ideal way, but there are literature reviews on that. So if you have one idea for an intervention, therapeutic intervention, for example, in psychotherapy, you could actually get somewhere in the area of 10 to 15 publications out of one thing. In this way, you're doing several things at once that we've talked about in the past. You're meeting your academic incentives to publish a whole hell of a lot. You're implementing it, seeing it take effect in the real world, true relevance. You're changing theory. That theory is not only helping as an outcome, but it's also reciprocal, so that you develop a theory, then you use the theory for the next idea, and you continue to grow. Then you can have an overall literature review or integration of all the results. So we're talking about all the boxes checked off by using this open source analogies model to relevance, theory, academic incentives, and really strong research can be truly effective. So this is a model that we have done and we've got away from a little bit. We're coming back to it and starting to do more of this. So kind of look for my lab to be producing this form of research using the open source analogy model, or as we call it, the AWESOME model. And that is one of the ways that we really get heavily into making our research relevant, useful, theory-driven, and meeting the academic incentives. So that's it for today. Next time, I will talk a little bit about how to create hybrid research design, where one research project assesses both effectiveness and implementation at the same time. So that's what I'll talk about next time. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you on the next session. Bye-bye.